All right, buckle up your belts, or perhaps loosen them, though you likely won't need to, because we're about to take a journey back to a time when the dinner bell often heralded disappointment, and the phrase farm to table meant a very short, very muddy, and frequently unappetizing trip. Forget your lavish kingly banquets and overflowing platters for a moment. For the vast majority, the culinary landscape of the medieval era was a master class in monotony and making do. Tonight, we're sinking our teeth into the often unpalatable truth of why food sucked in medieval times. But hey, before your stomach starts to rumble in sympathy or perhaps in protest, and you get comfortable for this feast of facts and famine, if this is the kind of historical deep fry you enjoy, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button. It keeps these historical cauldrons bubbling, and I'm always fascinated to see where our global village of history enthusiasts is tuning in from. So drop a comment below, letting us know what country you're watching from. Voilà. It truly makes my day seeing how far these stories travel, right? Where were we? Ah yes, the grim reality of the medieval trencher. Imagine this. You are a peasant, one of the countless souls whose sweat and toil form the very bedrock of this so-called age of chivalry. Your days are long, your labor back-breaking, from the first sliver of dawn till the last vestiges of twilight. And what fuels this relentless grind? What culinary delights await you at the end of a day spent ankle-deep in mud, wrestling with a stubborn plow, or tending to your lord's sheep? Prepare for a symphony of beige, a festival of blandness, a never-ending encore of, well, pottage. Yes, pottage. The cornerstone, the bedrock, the alpha and omega of your diet. Picture a large cauldron perpetually simmering over a smoky, open-less hearth in your small, dark, one-room hut. Into this cauldron goes whatever is available. Mostly it's grains, oats, barley, rye, rarely wheat, which is often reserved for your betters or for bread. These are boiled endlessly with water, perhaps a few sad-looking root vegetables like turnips or parsnips if the season is kind, or your small garden plot has yielded anything, maybe some beans or peas if you're lucky. Herbs, if you can find. Some wild ones, sure, throw them in, but spices, those magical dusts from the exotic East that transform food, those are the stuff of dreams, worth more than your entire hut. Your pottage is thick, a sort of savory porridge, often gritty from poorly milled flour, and almost invariably bland. It's sustenance, calories to keep you moving, but joy, flavor, variety, those are luxuries you can ill afford even to imagine. Then, there's bread, not the fluffy, white, crusty loaves you might picture. Oh no. Your bread is dark, heavy, made from rye or barley, often with added fillers like bean flour, or even in truly desperate times, ground up acorns or tree bark. It's coarse, dense, and requires serious jaw work. It's known as trencher bread for a reason. Sometimes stale slabs of it are literally used as plates to hold your pottage or whatever meager morsels you have, the plate then being eaten itself, or if you're particularly down on your luck, given to the dogs or the even more desperate. This bread is your constant companion, often baked only once a week or less, growing progressively harder and staler as the days wear on. Chewing it is a chore, digesting it a challenge. Scarcity is your shadow. The hungry gap, those lean, desperate months in late winter and early spring when last year's stores have dwindled to almost nothing and the new crops are yet to sprout, is a terrifyingly regular visitor. Your already meager portions shrink further. The pottage becomes more water than substance. Hunger pangs are a familiar sensation, a dull ache in your belly that you learn to live with, to work through. Famine, true, devastating famine, is only ever a bad harvest or a prolonged war away, capable of wiping out entire villages, leaving skeletal figures to haunt the barren fields. You live on the edge, always, and what of preserving what little you have? Forget refrigeration. Your primary methods are salting, smoking, and drying. Meat, a rare treat usually reserved for feast days or if an animal sickens and must be slaughtered, is heavily salted to prevent putrefaction. This leaves it incredibly tough, overwhelmingly salty, and requiring lengthy soaking in scarce, often unclean water, before it's even remotely palatable. Fish, if you live near a river or coast and have the rights to catch it, is similarly smoked or dried until it's as hard as wood, its flavor a distant memory. Vegetables are pickled in brine or vinegar if you have access to such things, often turning them into a sour, mushy accompaniment. The risk of food going off, of mold, rot, and the invisible dangers of spoiled food is a constant threat. A misjudged salting, a damp storage spot, and your precious winter stores could become a source of sickness rather than sustenance. You might try to supplement your diet by foraging. Wild greens, bitter though they may be, nuts, berries in season, perhaps even the occasional grub or snail if desperation truly bites. But the forests, teeming with deer, boar, and rabbits, are usually the Lord's domain. To hunt there, to take so much as a single rabbit for your starving family, is poaching, a crime punishable by fines, mutilation, like having your hand chopped off, or even death. So you watch the plump deer bound through the trees, your stomach rumbling, knowing that bounty is forbidden. Even your drink offers little cheer. Water from the local stream or well is often contaminated, a carrier of dysentery and other delightful ailments. So you drink ale or cider. Small beer, usually, weak, thin, and often sour, brewed at home. It's safer than the water, the brewing process killing some of the contaminants, but it's hardly a flavorful or invigorating beverage. It's just wet. And provides a few more calories. So as you sit down to your evening meal in your smoky hut, the dim light of a tallow candle casting flickering shadows, you look at the unappetizing mush in your wooden bowl. Take a bite of your hard, dark bread and wash it down with thin, sour ale. This is your life. A constant battle for calories, a monotonous cycle of blandness, a precarious existence where flavor is a forgotten dream, and hunger is a loyal, unwelcome friend. And this, my friends, is just the tip of the iceberg, or perhaps the mold on the bread. The ways food sucked in medieval times are as varied and unpleasant as the contents of a peasant's pottage pot after a long, hard winter. So, you've resigned yourself to a life fueled by a never-ending cycle of lumpy pottage and bread that could double as a whetstone. But the misery of medieval food didn't just stop at its soul-crushing monotony and the constant gnawing presence of hunger. Oh no, your culinary suffering had layers like a poorly made onion pasty, each one more unappetizing than the last. Let's peel back a few more, shall we? Consider the ever-present threat of spoilage, a silent, invisible enemy lurking in every larder, every sack of grain, every string of dried meat. Without refrigeration, without a proper understanding of germ theory, which was centuries away, keeping food edible was a constant, desperate battle. Your salted pork, if the salting wasn't thorough enough or the conditions damp, could quickly become a breeding ground for maggots, its surface glistening with a sheen of decay you'd try to scrape off, hoping the core was still salvageable. Your precious store of grain, the difference between winter survival and starvation, was a constant feast for rats, mice, and weevils, their droppings adding an unwelcome and often unnoticed seasoning to your daily bread. And then there was mold. Green, blue, black, white, a veritable rainbow of fungal growth could bloom with alarming speed on your bread, your cheese, if you were lucky enough to have any, and even your dried fruits. You might try to cut away the worst bits, your stomach churning, telling yourself that what remains is surely fine. But the musty taste, the slightly off smell, these were warnings your body often paid for later with stomach cramps, violent purging, or worse. Food poisoning wasn't a diagnosed ailment, it was just a bad belly, the flux, or God's displeasure, a common and often fatal part of life, directly linked to the perilous state of what passed for sustenance. If the natural decay wasn't enough, you also had to contend with the treachery of your fellow man. In a world where food was scarce and profit margins slim, the temptation for millers, bakers, and market vendors to adulterate their goods was often too strong to resist. That sack of flour you traded a week's worth of labor for, it might. Have a healthy dose of chalk, ground beans, or even sawdust mixed in to bulk it out, making your already gritty bread even more of an ordeal for your teeth and your digestion. Your ale, that supposed refuge from tainted water, could be watered down, or worse, have unsavory additions to mimic bitterness or strength. Things like bog myrtle, which could be mildly toxic in large doses, or other less identifiable herbage. Spices, if you ever encountered anything pretending to be one in a cheap market concoction, were notorious for being cut with everything from ground nutshells to dust. Every transaction was a gamble, every mouthful a potential betrayal. And speaking of teeth, let's not forget the state of your medieval mouth. Your diet of coarse, gritty bread, often containing literal stone dust from the milling process, acted like sandpaper on your enamel. Combined with a complete lack of dental hygiene as you'd understand it, perhaps a twig to pick at food, or a rub with a cloth and some abrasive salt if you were fastidious, your teeth were likely a mess. Caries, abscesses, and missing molars were the norm, not the exception. Imagine trying to chew that dense, stale rye bread or a tough piece of thrice-salted pork with a raging toothache, the pain sending jolts through your skull with every agonizing bite. Eating wasn't just a bland necessity. For many, it was an actively painful experience, further diminishing any potential for enjoyment. Even the science of the day conspired against palatable or sensible eating, at least for those who had any choice or sought remedies for illness. The prevailing theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dictated that foods had qualities of hot, cold, moist, or dry. Illness was an imbalance of these humors, and diet was a primary way to correct it. This meant that if you were sick, you might be prescribed bizarre and often unappetizing concoctions. A fever, too hot and dry, might be treated with cooling foods like cucumbers or melons, even if they were out of season or likely to cause digestive upset. A melancholic disposition, too cold and dry, might see you forced to consume warming and moistening foods regardless of their actual nutritional value or your personal taste. While you, the average peasant, likely wouldn't have a physician fussing over your humors for your daily pottage, these beliefs permeated society and influenced what was generally considered good or bad to eat, often with little basis in actual health. The sheer lack of variety, especially locked in by the seasons, was another torment. Summer and early autumn might offer a brief respite with a flush of fresh vegetables from your garden plot, some berries from the hedgerows, or perhaps even an apple or two. But as winter descended, your world would shrink back to the monotonous trinity of preserved grains, salted or smoked protein, if any, and whatever root vegetables had survived storage. For months on end, every meal was a variation on the same theme of bland, preserved fare. This didn't just dull the palate. It led to inevitable nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, with its bleeding gums and aching joints, was a winter visitor. Other ailments born of a limited diet were rife. Your cooking methods, too, were a sentence to blandness. Most peasant households had a single cauldron or pot suspended over an open fire in the middle of the hut. Roasting was a luxury requiring more fuel and different equipment. Frying was rare. Thus, most of your food was boiled. Boiled grains, boiled vegetables, boiled meat, if you had it, often all together in the same pot day after day. The flavors, or lack thereof, melding into a uniform, uninspiring mush. The concept of distinct dishes, of carefully layered flavors, was an alien one. Your food was functional, designed to fill the belly and provide enough energy for another day of back-breaking labor. Nothing more. The very idea that food could, or should, be a source of pleasure, of creativity, of delight, was a distant dream, as far removed from your daily reality as the king's bejeweled crown. And the unpleasant surprises, from weevils in your flour to the ever-present risk of rot, meant that every meal was approached with a certain degree of trepidation, a silent prayer that this particular bowlful wouldn't be the one to lay you low. So, you're navigating a world where your daily pottage is a bland lottery, and your bread could double as a doorstop, all while dodging the invisible menace of spoiled food and the outright villainy of dishonest tradesmen. You'd think that's enough misery for one trencher, wouldn't you? But oh, the medieval menu had more horrors in its pantry, and some of them were baked right into the very staff of life, especially if you were poor and reliant on the hardiest, cheapest grains. Let's talk about rye and the terrifying fiery curse it sometimes carried. St. Anthony's fire, rye bread, even darker and coarser than the barley loaves you might sometimes encounter, was a common staple, particularly in certain regions or during lean times when other grains failed. Rye was a tough crop, resilient, capable of growing in poorer soils where wheat wouldn't deign to sprout. It was, for many, the difference between a meager meal and outright starvation. You'd eat it without a second thought, this dense, often sour bread, grateful for the bulk it provided, however unappetizing its flavor or texture. You wouldn't know, couldn't know, that sometimes lurking within those humble grains was a silent, insidious poison. In damp, cool growing seasons, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, a name you'd never hear of course, could infect the rye crop. It manifested as dark, purplish-black, horn-like growths, sometimes called spurs or ergots, protruding from the heads of the rye. When harvest time came, these ergots, packed with potent alkaloids, would often be gathered along with the healthy grain. The miller, either ignorant of their danger or simply unwilling to waste precious flour, would grind them all together. And so, this fungal poison would find its way into your daily bread, an unseen demon in your meager sustenance. You'd eat the contaminated loaf, suspecting nothing. Perhaps it tasted a little more bitter than usual, or had a strange, unpleasant scent, but hunger blunts discernment, and when there's nothing else, you eat what's available. Then the nightmare would begin. Ergotism, the sickness born from this tainted rye, manifested in two horrifying forms, either of which was a sentence to unimaginable agony. The first, and perhaps most dreaded, was the gangrenous form, often called holy fire, or more commonly, St. Anthony's fire, after the saint whose intercession was desperately sought by its victims. It would start with an intense, unbearable burning sensation in your limbs, as if your very flesh were on fire from within. Your hands and feet would tingle, then go numb, then swell, blister, and turn a horrifying black as dry gangrene set in. The affected parts would become mummified, the dead flesh smelling of rot, even as you still lived and breathed. Eventually, with excruciating pain, your fingers, your toes, your hands, your feet might simply wither and fall off, leaving you horribly maimed, a grotesque ruin of a human being. Imagine the terror, the sheer, unadulterated horror of watching your own body decompose while you were still alive. The stench of your own putrefaction, your constant companion. The second form was convulsive ergotism. This attacked your central nervous system, a different kind of hell altogether. It would begin with muscle spasms, painful cramps that contorted your limbs into unnatural positions. Then came the convulsions, violent seizures that would rack your body, throwing you to the ground, your jaw clenched, foam frothing at your lips. But it didn't end there. Your mind, too, would become a battleground. Vivid hallucinations, terrifying visions of demons and hellfire would torment your waking hours. You might descend into delirium, babbling incoherently, or be seized by fits. of mania, screaming and thrashing with a strength born of madness. Peasants witnessing such an episode would see not a victim of food poisoning, but someone possessed by devils, further isolating you in your agony. There was no cure, of course. Medieval medicine, with its humors and its prayers, was utterly helpless against the potent toxins of the ergot fungus. Poultices, bleedings, desperate appeals to St. Anthony, none of it touched the relentless progression of the disease. If you survived the initial onslaught, which many did not, you were often left crippled, disfigured, your mind perhaps permanently scarred. Communities, even entire regions, could be devastated by outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire after a particularly bad harvest. The sight of afflicted individuals, their limbs blackened and twisted, or their minds lost to madness, was a terrifyingly common one in some areas. The grim lottery of it all added another layer to the dread. Not every rye harvest was contaminated. Not every loaf from an infected batch would contain enough ergot to trigger the full-blown horror. You might eat rye bread for months, years, with no ill effect. Then one day, a single tainted meal could plunge you into fiery agony or convulsive madness. It was a hidden, unpredictable threat lurking in the most basic, most essential of your foodstuffs. Your daily bread, the very symbol of life and sustenance, could become the instrument of your most horrific suffering and a grotesque, lingering death. That, in a nutshell, is a particularly nasty reason why medieval food didn't just suck in its blandness or scarcity. Sometimes it actively, terrifyingly tried to kill you in the most agonizing way imaginable, and you, the hungry peasant, had little choice but to take that dreadful gamble with every bite. So your daily existence is a grim battle against blandness, scarcity, and the ever-present threat of your own rye bread deciding to send you on a fiery, convulsive trip to the afterlife. You huddle in your smoky hut, gnawing on a crust that could sharpen steel, and you can't help but dream, can you? You dream of the Lord's castle, that imposing stone edifice on the hill, and the feasts you hear whispered about by passing servants or the occasional boastful man-at-arms. Surely their food doesn't suck. Surely up there life is a perpetual banquet, a paradise of succulent roasts, snowy white manchet bread, and wine that flows like water. Well, let's pull back the ermine-trimmed curtain on that noble nosh, shall we? Because while it was undeniably a universe away from your watery pottage and weevil-laced rye, the high table had its own peculiar set of gastronomic griefs. The grass, as they say, isn't always greener, especially if that grass is being used. To desperately scour a pot that held slightly too old venison. First, let's address the sheer overwhelming meatiness of it all. If you were a noble, your status was often measured by the groaning platters of flesh you could present. Roasted swans, often painstakingly redressed in their own feathers after cooking for a spectacular, if somewhat morbid presentation. Peacocks, served in similar funereal splendor, venison, boar, entire suckling pigs, countless varieties of game birds from heron to bustard, all piled high. It sounds impressive, a carnivore's dream. But imagine eating that day in, day out, with very little else to balance it. Fresh vegetables, especially green ones, were often viewed with suspicion by some echelons of the nobility, considered peasant fare, coarse and difficult to digest, or associated with an imbalance of the humors. So your noble gut was often processing a relentless onslaught of protein and fat, leading to a host of rather unpleasant ailments. Gout, that agonizing inflammation of the joints, was practically a badge of honor among the wealthy, a direct result of their rich, meat-heavy diet and copious alcohol consumption. And the quality of that meat? Therein lies another fragrant issue. While the Lord had access to freshly hunted game, preserving the sheer quantity needed for a large household or a major feast was a monumental challenge, even with access to salt ice houses in some rare, later medieval cases, and cellars. Meat was often hung for extended periods, sometimes to age it for tenderness, but just as often because there was simply too much to eat at once. The line between fashionably high game and dangerously putrid meat was a perilously thin one, often blurred by wishful thinking and a reluctance to waste expensive resources. This is where the famed medieval love of spices comes into play, but not always in the way you might romantically imagine. Yes, spices like pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger were incredibly expensive, status symbols flaunted by the rich. They added exotic, powerful flavors to dishes. But that powerful flavor also served another, less appetizing purpose: to mask the taste and smell of meat that was, let's say, on the turn. A generous dusting of mace or a drenching in a heavily spiced wine sauce could often make a haunch of venison that was beginning to whisper of the grave seem passably edible, if you weren't too discerning and the lighting in the great hall was sufficiently dim. So, while your peasant bread might try to kill you with fungus, the noble spiced peacock might be disguising its own journey towards decomposition. Then there were the subtleties, or entremets, those fantastical dishes brought out between courses at a great feast, designed more for spectacle than for actual consumption. Imagine a pie from which live birds flew out when cut, or a castle painstakingly sculpted from marchpane, or that refeathered swan. These were the medieval equivalent of a theatrical production intended to dazzle the guests and display the host's wealth and ingenuity. Actually eating them? Often they were more about form than flavor, or simply impractical. And the sheer amount of food prepared for these banquets meant that waste was colossal, even as you might be starving just beyond the castle walls, dreaming of the crumbs from their table, even their bread, that coveted white manchet, made from finely sifted wheat flour, wasn't always the pure delight you'd envision. While undoubtedly softer and more palatable than your rye doorstop, it too could suffer from poor milling, adulteration by dishonest bakers, adding cheaper meals, or simply growing stale quickly, if not consumed rapidly, by the large household. And their drink? The wine, often imported at great expense, could be rough, acidic, or prone to turning to vinegar if not stored correctly. It was frequently heavily spiced and sweetened with honey to make it more palatable, or to disguise its imperfections. The ale was stronger than your peasant brew, certainly, but quality control was as variable then as it is now, and a bad batch could still lead to a thoroughly unpleasant morning after. So, while you, the peasant, were battling the fundamentally suckiness of scarcity, blandness, and outright food dangers like ergotism, your lord and lady were navigating their own set of culinary challenges. Theirs was often a world of ostentatious excess, of unbalanced diets heavy on potentially turning meat, of flavors dominated by strong spices trying to win a war against incipient rot, and of spectacular dishes that were better looked at than eaten. Their food might have been gilded, but beneath the surface there was often a different, more subtle but equally potent kind of suckiness that came with the territory of the medieval high table. It certainly beat starvation, but a paradise of perfect gastronomy it was not. So your noble lord is occasionally wrestling with a suspiciously fragrant peacock, while you, the humble peasant, are still locked in your eternal tango with monotonous pottage and bread that could fell an ox. But the suckiness of medieval food wasn't just about what you did eat. It was profoundly shaped by what you couldn't eat, by the vast, ghostly emptiness in the medieval pantry where a host of modern staples simply didn't exist. Prepare to have your 21st century culinary assumptions thoroughly unseasoned. Imagine stepping into your medieval kitchen, if your one-room hut with its central fire pit even qualifies for such a grand term. What's missing? Well, for starters, forget potatoes. No golden fluffy roasted spuds, no comforting mash, no crispy fried slivers. That versatile tuber, a cornerstone of so many modern diets, was still biding its time in the distant Americas, entirely unknown to your medieval European palate. Tomatoes. Nope. That means no rich, savory sauces for your non-existent pasta. No bright, acidic counterpoint to fatty meats. Corn? Another New World phantom. So, no sweet corn, no polenta, no cornbread. Peppers, bell peppers, chili peppers, all absent. Think of the flavor profiles, the textures, the sheer variety these ingredients bring, and then imagine a culinary world utterly devoid of them. Your diet, especially if you were a commoner, revolved around a depressingly small cast of characters. Grains, yes, wheat, for the better off, rye, barley, oats. Legumes like peas and broad beans were crucial, but beyond that, the options thinned out dramatically. The vibrant array of vegetables and fruits you take for granted was a pale shadow of itself. Many of the specific cultivars we enjoy today hadn't been developed. What you had was seasonal, often coarse, and subject to the same issues of preservation and spoilage as everything else. Now let's talk about dairy, a category of medieval food that was both a blessing and a potential curse. Milk straight from the cow, goat, or ewe was a precious source of nutrition, especially for children or the infirm. But without refrigeration, it was a ticking time bomb. It soured with alarming speed, particularly in warmer weather, and if the animal was diseased or the milking unhygienic, which it often was by modern standards, that fresh, creamy milk could be a potent vector for all sorts of unpleasant illnesses. Summer sickness, often a euphemism for severe food poisoning from spoiled dairy or other foods, was a common and dangerous affliction. So, what did you do? You processed it quickly. Cheese and butter were the primary methods of preserving milk's goodness, but the results were a world away from the neatly packaged, consistently flavored products you know. Medieval cheese making was a highly variable art. Depending on the skill of the maker, the quality of the milk, and the often less than ideal storage conditions, your cheese could be anything from a hard, dry, salty block that required serious gnawing to a soft, alarmingly pungent ooze or a crumbly, sour disappointment. Mold was a frequent and not always benign guest on its surface. You'd scrape it off naturally and hope for the best. Butter, churned by hand, could easily turn rancid, developing a sharp, acrid taste that would make you wince. Yet it was a vital source of fat, and often the only spread available for your dense bread. During Lent and other numerous church-mandated fast days, when all animal products, including dairy and eggs, were forbidden, those who could afford it turned to milk of almonds. This involved grinding almonds, an expensive, often imported nut, and mixing them with water to create a whitish liquid that served as a substitute in cooking. It was a luxury, far beyond your peasant means. You, on fast days, simply did without, your already meager diet becoming even more restricted and joyless. And what of fruits and vegetables? As a peasant, you'd have your small garden plot, your curtilage, where you'd grow hardy staples, onions, leeks, garlic, all prized for their strong flavors that could liven up the blandest pottage, cabbages, turnips, parsnips, carrots, aubergine, though medieval carrots were often pale and woody, not the sweet orange varieties of today. Fresh greens like spinach or chard were welcome in season, but the season was everything. Winter meant a near total absence of fresh produce. What wasn't eaten immediately was pickled in brine or vinegar, a process that drastically altered its texture and leached out much of its nutritional value, leaving you with sour, mushy remnants to chew through during the bleak months. Fruit, too, was a seasonal treat. Apples, pears, plums, wild berries, delightful when fresh but quickly preserved by drying, turning them into tough, leathery chews, or, for the wealthier, by candying in honey or expensive sugar. The idea of eating a crisp apple in the depths of January was pure fantasy. Furthermore, there was a lingering suspicion, particularly among the more learned and those influenced by humoral theory, about consuming raw fruits and vegetables, as they were often considered cold and moist and potentially upsetting to the bodily humors, or simply a source of fluxes and agues if unwashed or gathered from dubious sources. Sweetness, that siren call to the human palate, was a muted affair in your medieval world. Refined sugar, made from cane, was an incredibly expensive import, a luxury item used sparingly by the very wealthy, often more as a spice or a medicine than a common sweetener. For you, and indeed for most of society, the primary sweetener was honey. Delicious, certainly, but its availability depended on beekeeping, and its flavor could be strong and distinct, not always suited to every dish. Medieval desserts, when they existed for common folk, were often simple fruit tarts sweetened with honey, or perhaps a sweetened porridge or bread pudding if ingredients allowed. The intense, sugary confections you associate with dessert were largely absent from your experience, so your medieval pantry wasn't just lacking in certain star items. Its entire foundation was different, built on a narrow range of often unreliable ingredients. The ghosts of potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and 1,000 other modern conveniences haunted its emptiness, leaving your diet monotonous, often nutritionally, deficient, and a constant source of worry and dissatisfaction. The very building blocks of flavor and variety that you take for granted were simply not there, ensuring that even on your best days, your food probably still, in its own quiet medieval way, sucked. So, you've navigated the phantom pantry, mourned the missing potatoes and tomatoes, and developed a healthy suspicion of anything too creamy or suspiciously cheap from the market. You understand that the ingredients themselves were often a source of profound suckiness. But what about the journey from raw material, however questionable, to something resembling a meal? For that, you'd often have to venture into the heart of the medieval food operation, the kitchen. And whether it was your own smoky peasant hearth or the vast, chaotic sculleries of a great lord, these were rarely havens of culinary delight. More often they were chambers of heat, grime, and backbreaking toil. Let's start with your own peasant kitchen, if you can even call it that. It's not a separate room, of course. It's the central, usually poorly ventilated section of your one-room hut, dominated by an open fire pit on the earthen floor, or perhaps a slightly raised hearth against one wall. The smoke from this fire, burning green wood or peat if you couldn't afford seasoned logs, has nowhere to go but up into the already blackened thatch, or, more frequently, into your eyes, your lungs, and every nook and cranny of your dwelling. The air is perpetually hazy, stinging your eyes, coating everything with a fine layer of soot. Your main cooking vessel is a single, heavy iron cauldron suspended over the flames by a hook and chain. In this, everything gets boiled together. Your pottage, any scraps of meat, whatever vegetables you have, creating that homogeneous, endlessly simmering stew of subsistence. There's no oven for baking your own bread. That's usually done at a communal village oven, if one exists and you can pay the fee, or by a village baker whose own hygiene standards are a gamble. Your countertop is a rough wooden board, if you're lucky. Your sink is a bucket of often murky water. It's primitive, smoky, and incredibly limited. Now, imagine graduating to a kitchen in a noble's castle, a monastery, or a wealthy merchant's house. Bigger, yes. More equipment? Certainly, but also in many ways a more concentrated form of culinary hell. These kitchens were vast, cavernous spaces, often set apart from the main dwelling to reduce the risk of fire, a very real and constant danger. They were beehives of frantic activity, especially when a feast was being prepared. Multiple massive fireplaces roared simultaneously, spitting sparks and belching out prodigious amounts of heat and smoke, despite rudimentary chimneys or smoke holes in the roof. The temperature in these infernos, especially in summer, would be stifling, the air thick, with grease, steam, the stench of butchered meat, boiling cauldrons, and roasting flesh. The noise would be deafening, the clang of heavy iron pots and pans, the thud of cleavers on massive wooden chopping blocks, the shouts of the master cook trying to be heard over the din, the sizzle of fat-hitting flames, the grinding of spices in stone mortars, and the constant scuttling of underlings. And the smells. While the aroma of roasting meat might sound appealing, imagine it mixed with the scent of overflowing refuse bins, unwashed bodies working in intense heat, the acrid smoke, and perhaps the faint but persistent undertone of vermin. Rats and mice were unwelcome but constant kitchen companions, always ready to pilfer a dropped morsel or investigate a poorly stored sack of flour. Hygiene, as you'd understand it, was a largely alien concept. Running water was a rare luxury, usually confined to a pump or well in the courtyard. Scullions washed mountains of greasy pots and wooden trenchers in tubs of lukewarm, increasingly filthy water. Food scraps were often thrown onto the floor, to be later swept up or not, along with rushes that might have been there for weeks, absorbing spills and grime. Flies buzzed everywhere. Personal hygiene amongst the kitchen staff, who worked long, sweaty hours in stifling conditions, was rudimentary, at best. The same hands that stoked the fire or wiped a sweaty brow might then be kneading dough or turning a spit. It's a miracle anyone survived the food, frankly. And the jobs themselves. At the top was the master cook, a figure of immense importance, and often a tyrannical temper, responsible for orchestrating the entire chaotic ballet. But beneath him were ranks of lesser mortals toiling in specific miseries. Consider the spit-turner, often a young boy, a turn-broche, forced to sit for hours beside a roaring fire, slowly, endlessly, rotating a heavy spit laden with roasting meat. The heat was intense, the boredom mind-numbing, the air filled with choking smoke and sizzling fat that could spit and burn. If he dozed off or let the meat scorch, a beating was the likely reward. Then there were the scullions, whose existence was a perpetual cycle of scrubbing greasy, soot-blackened pots with sand and harsh soap, their hands raw, their backs aching. There were those who plucked endless fowl, those who gutted fish, those who pounded almonds into paste for hours on end. Every task was arduous, repetitive, and performed in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint. Even the master cook, despite his status, was under immense pressure. He had to contend with ingredients of variable quality, preserve vast quantities of food without reliable methods, and produce elaborate dishes designed to impress a demanding and often fickle lord. A failed feast, a dish that displeased the noble palate, could have serious consequences for his reputation and employment. He was part magician, part drill sergeant, part alchemist, trying to transform often unpromising materials into something edible or at least spectacular in a kitchen that was more a battlefield than a place of culinary artistry. So while the food that eventually emerged might have been destined for a high table, its journey through the medieval kitchen was often a testament to human endurance in the face of heat, grime, and sheer unrelenting toil, another layer. To why the whole medieval food experience, from farm to feasting hall, frequently and profoundly sucked. So your food has journeyed from a potentially blighted field through a treacherous market into a kitchen that's more inferno than culinary haven, and has finally, against all odds, arrived in some semblance of a meal. Surely now you can at least enjoy it in peace. Well, let's pull up a wobbly stool and examine the medieval dining experience itself. Because even if the food miraculously managed to be halfway decent, the way it was often consumed could add a whole new layer to why it thoroughly sucked. For you, the humble peasant, mealtime in your one-room, smoke-filled hut is a rudimentary affair. There's no polished oak table laid with fine linen. You likely huddle around the central hearth or a rough-hewn trestle board. Individual plates, a distant dream. Your main course, the eternal pottage, is likely served in a single large wooden or earthenware bowl, into which everyone dips their spoon, if you have one, or more commonly, their hunk of coarse bread. Fingers are primary utensils. Personal hygiene is, shall we say, a luxury, and hands that have been toiling in the fields, tending livestock, or mucking out the byre are now delving into the communal pot. The floor is earthen, probably strewn, with rushes that haven't been changed in weeks, harboring fleas, spilled food, and whatever else has been tracked in. Your dog, if you have one, likely sits at your feet, scratching, hoping for a dropped morsel or a gnawed bone. It's less a dining experience and more a basic refueling stop undertaken in dim, smoky, and often crowded conditions. Now, let's climb the social ladder to a minor noble's hall or even a grander feast. Things are certainly more elaborate, but not necessarily more appetizing by modern standards. You might have a tablecloth, though its cleanliness could be dubious. Instead of individual plates, you'd likely still be using trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, to hold your meat and sop up the sauces. These would be shared perhaps between two people. You'd have knives and spoons for liquids, but forks were still an exotic, somewhat suspect Italian novelty, viewed by some as an effeminate affectation. So again, fingers played a starring role in conveying food to mouth. Bones, gristle, and other inedible bits. Those were often simply tossed onto the floor for the numerous dogs that roamed freely under the tables, adding to the general din and aroma of the hall. Shared drinking cups were common, passed from hand to hand, lip to lip. Belching was often considered a sign of appreciation for the meal, and other bodily noises might also make an unapologetic appearance. It was a communal, often boisterous, and decidedly unhygienic affair, even amidst the relative splendor, but perhaps one of the most profound ways food sucked, cutting across nearly all social strata, was the tyranny of the church's fast days. And there were a lot of them. Every Friday, of course, all of Lent, 40 days of it. Vigils before major feast days, ember days, rogation days. Add it all up, you could be looking at close to half the year when meat was strictly forbidden, and often eggs and dairy products, like tacchina, were off the menu too. For you, the peasant whose diet was already perilously low on protein and variety, these fast days were a particular hardship. Reducing your already meager fare to little more than thin vegetable pottage, dark bread, and perhaps some nuts or dried peas. For those who could afford it, fast days meant one thing above all others: fish. And not necessarily the glistening, fresh-caught trout or salmon you might imagine. For the vast majority of the population, especially those living inland, fast-day fish meant preserved fish, salted cod, dried herring, pickled mackerel, smoked eel. These were the staples that filled the endless, meatless days. And let me tell you, this wasn't your charming, modern, artisanal smoked salmon. Imagine salted cod, dried as hard as a ship's timber. Before it could even be contemplated for a meal, it required hours, sometimes days, of soaking in changes of precious water to desalinate it and rehydrate it to something vaguely resembling flesh. Even then, the texture was often incredibly tough, stringy and chewy, its flavor an overpowering memory of the sea mixed with a lingering, aggressive saltiness. Or consider the humble herring, king herring, as it was sometimes called due to its ubiquity. Smoked or pickled, it was cheap, it traveled well, but oh, the monotony. The overpowering oily, fishy taste and smell permeated everything. You'd have herring boiled, herring baked, if you had an oven, herring in pottage, herring with mustard, a common attempt to disguise its relentless fishiness. Week after week, month after month, the same unyielding, often unappetizing piscine penance. Fresh fish was a luxury, available primarily to those living near coasts, rivers, or well-stocked monastic fish ponds. And even then, without refrigeration, fresh was a relative term. fish spoils with notorious speed, and a catch that wasn't consumed or preserved almost immediately could quickly become a source of gastric distress. The attempts to make this relentless diet of fish more palatable often involved boiling it into oblivion or dousing it in the few strong-tasting herbs or spices available, like mustard, horseradish, or garlic if you were lucky. The subtle flavors we appreciate in well-cooked fish were usually lost or deliberately masked. This fish-heavy diet on fast days wasn't just a trial for the taste buds. It could also be nutritionally unbalanced. While fish provided protein, the reliance on heavily salted or smoked varieties, often paired with the same limited range of vegetables and grains, meant that the overall dietary picture was still far from ideal. The joyless, obligatory consumption of often tough, overly salty, or unpleasantly oily fish, day in and day out, for vast stretches of the year, was a culinary cross that nearly everyone in medieval Europe had to bear. It was a constant, depressing reminder that even when food was available, it could still, in its own special way, thoroughly and comprehensively suck. And as you chewed your way through another leathery piece of stockfish, you'd be forgiven for thinking that perhaps a little bit of meaty sin on a Friday might just be worth the risk to your immortal soul. So, you've endured the communal slop bucket of peasant dining, navigated the treacherous etiquette of the noble's often unhygienic high table, and gagged your way through more fast-day preserved fish than any soul should have to countenance. Your daily bread is a potential vessel of fiery agony, and your ale is thin and sour. Surely, you think, there must have been some escape, some small culinary comfort, some little treat to look forward to? Well, let's delve into the world of what happened when the already meager stores ran truly low, and then examine the often disappointing reality of medieval sweets. Prepare for your hopes, like a poorly made blancmange, to utterly collapse. For you, the peasant, when the grain bin was scraping bottom and the hungry gap stretched before you like a barren desert, foraging wasn't a quaint pastoral hobby. It was a grim, back-breaking necessity. You'd scour the hedgerows and woodlands, those parts not forbidden by your lord at least, for anything remotely edible. Nettles, dandelions, wild garlic sorrel, these common weeds, often bitter and tough, would be bulked out your already watery pottage, providing some scant greenery but little real sustenance. You'd dig for roots, burdock, wild parsnip, hoping desperately you didn't misidentify it for something poisonous, a common and fatal mistake. In autumn, you'd gather nuts, hazelnuts if you were lucky, but more often acorns, which required laborious processing of leaching out their bitter tannins before they could be ground into a coarse, unappetizing meal to extend your flour. Berries, blackberries, wild strawberries, rowan berries were a fleeting seasonal boon, often fiercely competed for. But what happened when even these meager pickings failed? What about times of true famine, siege, or utter destitution? Then, my friend, the medieval menu took a truly horrifying turn into the realm of desperation foods. People ate things that would make your modern stomach revolt. Tree bark, a common famine food, would be stripped, dried, and ground into a powder to mix with whatever scraps of flour remained, creating a bread that was mostly indigestible fiber and bitterness. Sawdust, as mentioned before, was another known adulterant or extender. Leather, old shoes, scraps from the tannery, discarded belts would be boiled for hours, sometimes days, in an attempt to extract some minute, gelatinous nourishment, resulting in a foul-smelling, gluey broth. And yes, in the direst straits, people ate vermin. Rats and mice, already unwelcome guests in hovels and granaries, became a source of protein, hunted and consumed with a grim necessity that overrode any natural revulsion. During sieges, cats and dogs within the city walls were often the first to disappear into the cooking pots. Snails, frogs, and even earthworms, while perhaps not universally consumed, were certainly on the menu for those with no other options. this wasn't about choice or flavor. It was about the primal, desperate urge to stay alive, to find enough calories to see another sunrise, even if those calories came from the most repulsive of sources. The suckiness here wasn't just blandness or monotony. It was the profound degradation of having to consume the inedible to fend off starvation. Now, let's try to lighten the mood, if such a thing is possible, and talk about sweets or desserts. For the vast majority of the medieval population, like you, the peasant, the concept of a separate dessert course, a sweet treat to end the meal, was largely non-existent. Your pottage and bread was the meal. If there was any sweetness to be had, it was often incorporated directly into the main fare, or it was a very rare, simple affair. A piece of fresh fruit, if it was the right season, and your small tree had yielded anything, was a luxury. Perhaps a small oat cake or a piece of your coarse bread, drizzled with a precious smear of honey. That was the height of peasant indulgence. Honey was the king of sweeteners for most of medieval Europe. Sugar, derived from cane, was an incredibly expensive imported luxury, often classed with exotic spices and used more by apothecaries for medicinal concoctions or by the fabulously wealthy as a display of status than as a common culinary ingredient. So, when you think of medieval sweet, think honey, in your ale, if you could afford it. In mead, perhaps used to preserve fruit or to glaze a rare piece of roasted meat, if your lord was feeling generous on a feast day. Its flavor, depending on the source, could be strong, floral, sometimes even a little bitter, a far cry from the neutral sweetness of refined sugar. Even for the nobility who did have access to sugar and a wider array of ingredients, desserts were often very different from what you might expect. While they enjoyed fruit tarts, custards, sometimes baked in pastry coffins, those thick, inedible crusts we talked about, and fritters, many of their elaborate sweet dishes were as much about spectacle and demonstrating wealth as about pure deliciousness. Marchpane, a stiff paste made from almonds and sugar, was sculpted into incredible shapes: animals, castles, allegorical figures, often gilded or brightly colored with vegetable dyes. Impressive to look at, certainly, but often dry and intensely sweet in a way that might seem cloying to a modern palate. Jellies were popular, but these weren't just sweet fruit jellies. They were often made with meat or fish stock, like aspic, clarified, sweetened, spiced, and elaborately colored and molded. Imagine a blancmange, a classic medieval dish, which, despite its name, white eating, was often a savory concoction of chicken or fish, rice, almond milk, and sugar, a flavor combination that might raise a few eyebrows today. Sweet spiced wines were common after a meal, and comfits, seeds, or nuts coated in hardened sugar were nibbled. But the sheer variety and accessibility of sugary snacks, candies, chocolates, and baked goods that you enjoy today was utterly unimaginable. There were no casual chocolate bars, no bags of crisps, no ice cream. Eating was largely confined to set meal times, and treats were rare, often tied to specific religious festivals or celebrations, and even then, far simpler and less intensely sweet than their modern counterparts. So, whether you were scraping the bottom of the literal barrel for tree bark or attending a noble feast featuring a gilded marchpane dragon, the world of medieval sweets was either a phantom or a far cry from the sugary delights, adding yet another, perhaps more subtle layer to why medieval food from top to bottom of the social scale often just plain sucked. So, you've stomached the reality of desperation dinners where tree bark might feature as a main course, and you've come to terms with the fact that medieval sweets were often bizarre, underwhelming, or simply non-existent for your peasant palate. You've accepted that your daily fare is a monotonous cycle of bland grains and questionable preserved goods. But the suckiness of medieval food didn't just end with its taste, texture, or availability. Oh no. It extended into a far more insidious, realm, the constant, often invisible threat of sickness lurking in almost every bite and sip. Welcome to the medieval feast of filth, where sanitation was a distant dream and your stomach was a perpetual battleground. Let's start with the very water you drank and used in your cooking. For you, the peasant, access to clean, safe water was a gamble. Your village well might be perilously close to the latrine pit or the animal enclosure, its contents a murky soup of surface runoff, animal waste, and who knows what else. Rivers and streams, often the primary water source for larger towns, also served as convenient dumping grounds for human refuse, offal from butcheries and industrial waste from tanneries or dyers. You might try to let the sediment settle, or perhaps strain it through a piece of cloth, but the unseen enemies, the flux-inducing microbes, the dysentery-causing demons, as you might understand them, remained. This very water was then used to boil your pottage, to wash your vegetables if they were washed at all, and to rinse your wooden bowls and spoons, often in a perfunctory swish that did little to remove lingering contaminants. Now, consider meat and fish, those rare and prized sources of protein. The journey from animal to your trencher was fraught with peril. Picture a medieval butcher's stall in a crowded market. Animals were often slaughtered right there in the street or in nearby abattoirs where hygiene was non-existent. Blood and entrails would mingle with the mud and refuse, attracting swarms of flies, nature's busy little vectors of disease. The meat, once butchered with tools that were rarely properly cleaned, would hang exposed to the elements, to dust, to yet more flies, until it was sold. There was no refrigeration to halt the rapid march of decay. You buy your small, precious piece, already perhaps a day or two past its prime, its surface a little too slick, its smell a little too strong. You'd take it home and cook it over your smoky fire, but undercooking, especially of pork, was a common risk, potentially leading to a delightful infestation of parasitic worms, tapeworms, trichinosis, that would add their own special brand of suffering to your already burdened existence. Fish, especially freshwater varieties from polluted rivers, carried their own risks of parasites and toxins. Dairy, as we've touched upon, was another minefield. Milk, drawn from cows or goats whose own health might be questionable, handled in unwashed pails by unwashed hands, could quickly become a breeding ground for sickness, especially in the warmer months. The summer complaint, a vague term for a host of violent gastrointestinal illnesses, often laid low entire families who had consumed tainted milk, butter, or cheese. Your bit of hard, possibly moldy cheese might not just taste bad, it might actively try to kill you. Even your staple pottage, that ever-simmering cauldron, could betray you. While the prolonged boiling might kill some contaminants if new unwashed or slightly spoiled ingredients were continually added without the whole pot reaching a sufficient temperature, it could become a slow brewing culture of unpleasantness. A communal pot, shared by many, meant that one person's ailment could quickly become everyone's. And then there were the grand feasts of the nobility, which you might imagine were bastions of culinary safety, given the wealth involved. Think again. Preparing food for hundreds of guests often meant cooking dishes well in advance. Elaborate pies, roasted meats, and jellies might sit out for hours, sometimes days, in various states of preparation or display, in kitchens that, as we've discussed, were far from sterile. This was a perfect recipe for spectacular outbreaks of food poisoning. The banquet's revenge, a sudden violent wave of vomiting and diarrhea sweeping through the assembled nobles and their retainers, was not an uncommon occurrence, sometimes felling more knights than a minor skirmish. When sickness did strike, as it inevitably and frequently did, what then? Your understanding of disease was rooted in humors, divine displeasure, or malevolent airs. The cures were often as bad as the ailment. You might be subjected to violent purges or emetics designed to make you vomit, prescribed by a local wise woman or a barber surgeon. the idea being to expel the bad humors or the offending food. Or you might be bled, further weakening your already struggling body. Herbal concoctions, some harmless, some actively detrimental, would be administered. Mostly you just suffered, hoping your constitution was strong enough to weather the storm raging in your guts. This constant low-level and sometimes high-level assault of contaminated food and water had a cumulative effect. A populace weakened by a poor and often unsafe diet was far more susceptible to other diseases, less able to recover from injuries, and generally lived with a host of chronic digestive complaints that were simply considered a normal part of life. The energy that could have gone into productive labor or even a moment's enjoyment was sapped by a body constantly fighting off invisible invaders from its own sustenance. So the suckiness of medieval food wasn't just about taste or variety. It was about the fundamental, life-threatening betrayal of nourishment, turning the very act of eating into a daily game of Russian roulette with your health. And the odds, more often than not, were decidedly not in your favor. And so we arrive at the dregs of our medieval culinary journey, having navigated a landscape of perpetual pottage, bread that could break your teeth or poison your mind, feasts of questionable freshness, and the ever-present invisible armies of contaminants, turning your daily sustenance into a game of chance. As you, the medieval peasant, noble, or town dweller, finally push away from this imaginary table, the lingering aftertaste is likely one of profound relief that your own pantry is stocked with marvels and safeties undreamt of in those shadowed centuries. Why did food so comprehensively suck in medieval times? It was a perfect storm of relentless, grinding poverty for the masses, a profound ignorance of hygiene and nutritional science, the tyranny of the seasons in a world without global supply chains, and the constant, gnawing fear of scarcity. For you, the peasant, it was the soul-crushing monotony of the same few bland, coarse ingredients, day in, day out, often insufficient to truly fill your belly or fuel your endless labor. It was the grit in your bread, the weevils in your grain, the sourness of your ale, the bitter greens foraged from the hedgerow when nothing else was forthcoming. It was the terror of the hungry gap, the specter of famine, and the knowledge that your children might go to bed with aching bellies more often than not. It was the treachery hidden within your staple foods, the St. Anthony's fire, that could turn your rye loaf into an instrument of unimaginable torment, the spoiled meat or fish that could leave you writhing with the bloody flux, the contaminated water that carried unseen death in every sip. It was the sheer back-breaking labor of producing even these meager victuals, only to see a significant portion lost to rot, vermin, or the Lord's often exorbitant tithes and taxes. Even if you were a noble, perched at the high table amidst a theatrical display of roasted peacocks and gilded subtleties, the suckiness, though different, was still pervasive. It was the heavy, unbalanced diet of endless meat, often teetering on the edge of putrescence, its true state masked by a barrage of expensive spices. It was the risk of gout, the discomfort of a digestive system constantly under siege, and the knowledge that even your fine white manchet bread might be less than pure, your expensive wine potentially flawed. It was the understanding that much of the spectacle was just that, show, not substance, while just beyond your castle walls, true hunger stalked the land. For everyone, food was a source of anxiety. The medieval cook toiled in a smoky, sweltering, unhygienic hell, trying to conjure edibility from often dubious ingredients under immense pressure. The diner, whether peasant or lord, approached many meals with a degree of trepidation, never entirely sure what unseen dangers might lurk within that stew or beneath that pastry crust. The fast days imposed by the Church, while spiritually significant, were a culinary torment, reducing diets to an endless parade of often unpalatable preserved fish and meager vegetable fare, further entrenching the monotony. The absence of so many ingredients we deem essential today Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peppers, plentiful sugar, a wide variety of fruits and vegetables year-round, meant that the medieval flavor palette was inherently limited, blander, less vibrant. The joy of eating, the sheer pleasure of diverse tastes and textures, was a privilege afforded to very few, and even then, it was a pleasure frequently compromised by the realities of the age. This wasn't just about an unpleasant meal here or there. This constant struggle with food, its scarcity, its poor quality, its dangers, had a profound impact on medieval life. It contributed to shorter lifespans, higher infant mortality, a populace often weakened by malnutrition and chronic illness, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. Food, or the lack of it, was a constant source of social tension, sometimes erupting into riots and rebellions. It shaped their bodies, their health, their very outlook on a world where the next meal was never truly guaranteed and could, in fact, be your last. So, as you step away from this medieval table, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the clean water from your tap, the astonishing variety in your local supermarket, the stringent food safety standards that protect you, the sheer, unadulterated pleasure of a well-cooked, flavorful, and safe meal. The medieval world, for all its tapestries and tournaments, often served up a daily diet of profound suckiness, a truth that shaped the lives and often hastened the deaths of those who endured it. Their struggle for simple, decent sustenance was a testament to human resilience, but a grim reminder that for much of history, the act of eating was less a pleasure and more a perilous, often deeply unpleasant necessity. And that wraps up our rather unappetizing tour of why food truly sucked in medieval times. Thank you for sticking with it, even if it might have put you off your lunch. I find these deep dives into the everyday realities of the past utterly fascinating, even the grim bits. If you found this journey through the medieval menu compelling, or if it made you appreciate your own dinner a bit more, please do smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next historical exploration. We've always got something brewing in the cauldron of the past. What other aspects of medieval life, or any other historical period, do you think really sucked? I love hearing your ideas, so drop a comment below and let me know what topics you'd like to see tackled next. I do read them all and often find inspiration there. Before you head off to raid your well-stocked fridge, thanks for watching.